Hey everyone, welcome to the Catholic Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Fisher. Today, we have two guests with us, Ethan Stueve and Patrick Neve. You know them as the hosts of the Crunchcast. Before we invite them in, question of the week, what's your favorite business podcast or Catholic podcast that is not this one, if this is your favorite? So let me know. Without further ado, I'm going to let them come on in to introduce themselves. Hey Ethan, hey Patrick.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you guys. Why don't we just go ahead and start off with you guys introducing yourselves?
Absolutely. My name's Ethan Stueve. I'm a husband, father, 27-year-old tastemaker and influencer. I don't really know how to describe myself. My day job is in digital marketing. I've been running this podcast called The Crunch Catholic Podcast for 7.5 years with my buddy Patrick. Along the way, I went from being a single college guy to being a single focus missionary, and then a married real estate agent, and now doing what I do with the kid and one on the way. So I've kind of been through the whole. Patrick has been the constant, and the podcast has been the constant through the last 7 or 8 years of my life. So happy to be here today. Patrick, I don't know if we can hear your microphone. I think you're a little not on the right setting. And you'd think with this being the whole thing, you might have to edit this, Mitch.
That's okay. I love the fact that you guys are also podcast hosts, because this is going to be the most well done video audio production I've had.
Yeah, I mean, we'll make it easy for you. We have the exact same microphone setup, it looks like.
Yeah, look, I just got this like a few months ago too, and I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
so
it's nice.
I think it's helped a lot. But
there we go. Now we can hear you.
How's it going, Patrick?
Perfect. It's going good, Mitch. Thanks for having us.
Of course, yeah. Patrick, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So similar to Ethan, I also started a podcast called The Crunch 7.5 years ago. It's crazy. We have so much in common. I studied theology at Franciscan University. I was a youth minister after that for about 4 years, and now I work at a Catholic media company in my hometown, and I do The Crunch. And again, Ethan and The Crunch have been the constant. Now I'm married, one kid, one on the way. It's good.
Very cool. Exciting. How did you guys, let's go back to the beginning of the Crunchcast. I want to know how you two met and started the podcast, like the early days.
Wow. This is old school stuff. So back when Twitter was fun and owned by liberals, it was which is not the correlation, not causation. But back when Twitter was fun, we were both anonymous Twitter accounts. This was a big thing in like 2012 to 2015. It felt like there were just a lot of people that were posting about the Catholic faith, but behind an anonymous profile, which now anons have come back in a big way, just on a different side of the internet. But we were posting about the faith and we were having a good time. And I had listened to a few podcasts and I was growing frustrated with the lack of, I would say, young people in mind when people were making these podcasts. I was 19 and I just none of them were funny. None of them were interesting. Like, it was just a lot of information and old guys doing banter that they thought was funny because it was old guys doing banter, like it wasn't actually, people get on podcasts, they think they're funny. But they're just
one day we'll be the old guys doing
no, but
banter.
we'll be funny.
Then
that's the difference, is we actually care about the craft of being funny and not just like I've got my coffee here for this podcast, gotta have some coffee. That type of thing drives me insane. So I tweeted, I said, does anyone want to do a podcast with me? I'd like to start by talking about Catholic dating, which I didn't know very much about as a single man, but I figured that qualified me enough to talk about it. And Patrick was the first person to respond in my DMs, and I thought his tweets were funny. And so our first conversation ever was our first podcast. We didn't meet in person for like 4 months, and we met at the Seek conference that year, 2017. And then we just kind of kept going because people seemed to really like what we were doing, because I think it was and still is the most unique Catholic podcast out there, because we like to teach people things, but not really. And we like to make people laugh, but we're also deeply Catholic in our identity. And so I don't know of any other podcast that does that. in the same way. So that's why we've kept it going. If it didn't need to happen, we would stop. But
Yes.
yeah, did I miss anything,
There's
Patrick?
so many other things we need to do.
Yeah, I have taxes to pay.
So that's really cool. I did not realize that you both ran anonymous Twitter accounts, and that's how it like got connected. What's been the most interesting thing that's happened since starting, or the most surprising? You probably both have like different stories since starting this podcast. Like, does anything come to mind?
I mean, the response has honestly been surprising. The fact that it's continued for this long is surprising. I thought for sure it would end much sooner. We're old now, but the audience grew with us, which is great, and we're continuing to bring new people in, and they're jumping right in, and they're not what we haven't gotten too in the weeds, inside jokey, that sort of thing. We're very people can listen to the first episode, then that next week's episode and be perfectly fine. So that's one surprising aspect. Also, I'm also surprised by how perfect mine and Ethan's chemistry was. Like our personalities meshed, even though we just kind of randomly decided to start a podcast together, having never met before. I'm surprised that it went that well.
Yeah, I think it's a testament to the fact that we both care more about being funny and about presenting a good product than we cared about seeming smart or wanting to convey our interpretation of something to the audience, which is where I think a lot of podcasts fail. Is like we just cared about being entertaining, and I think that's kind of informed a lot of our decisions strategically and otherwise throughout the years.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know that like in entrepreneurship, it's like, what is it? The content is kind of like secondary to the product. That's not a bad thing. It's like the content serves the product, whereas like in the crunch, the content is the product. We wanted it to be really, really good. And I think that content. Maybe actually no, I changed that. Because the content, if you create content, it should be the product. It should be a product, and you should make it really, really good. And it shouldn't be secondary. Like if you're gonna do it, same way we wouldn't do that with advertising. We wouldn't be like, advertising just kind of secondary. I'm gonna make it okay. It's like, no, the ad needs to be really good. It needs to be an art in and of itself. And so I think we got really good at content before we actually had a business, which I think has served us as we've started building one around the content.
Totally.
Definitely. Yeah. How has that looked transitioning from like realizing you had something interesting here, and I know you guys have had a lot more like business side things happening lately.
Yeah.
How has that transition looked? What are some of the things that you had to start doing because you realized like, oh my gosh, like we have like an audience, like this is turning into something more?
Selling ad space, which is difficult. I wasn't very good at that until it became my day job, and now I'm better at it. Selling has been an interesting. I was a youth minister, right? Like it was very much a transactional activity, convincing people to follow Jesus. And so, that taking on that role has been a challenge, but it's been a good learning experience.
Yeah, I also think I've had a hard time. We've learned a lot in just trying to get all the different pieces to fit together like a puzzle. We've been talking about this a lot, where it feels like we have all the different pieces of a really successful content business, but in terms of fitting them together snugly in a way that's cohesive has been really challenging. So like we've got this Instagram page that has 37,000 followers, but we haven't effectively made it so that it's always growing and always pointing people to our paid offerings, like our course and our, some downloadable things that we have, or the podcast. And then the podcast is really good, but it doesn't really interface with the social media stuff at all. And we have like a Discord, which is great. And a lot of people find the Discord from Instagram and the podcast. But the Discord doesn't really point anybody to any of the paid offerings either. And then we have a Patreon. It's successful for our size. We have over 100 patrons that support us month to month, and it's a good chunk of our revenue. But we haven't really figured out a way to implement like a real sales process with the Patreon. So like, I mean, we know how to do it, but it just in terms of having people generate referrals and like bringing new people on board and having specific events for the Patreon so that people sign up. Like there, and the advertising thing and the live show component, which is another aspect of it. So like we've done all of these things successfully at different times, but in terms of doing them all well and firing on all cylinders so that we can not squeeze every last drop out of our fruit juice, but to have sustainable, predictable success over a long period of time. And I feel like we're finally
make a really good win-win.
close to that, but it's just almost.
So close.
We're close.
Someone mentioned that like I was watching this course guy, and he's a podcaster, and he was like, "Their podcasts have 4 components. Is your podcast discoverable? What's your podcast marketing look like? How do you get in front of new listeners? How do you convince those new listeners that your podcast is interesting to get them to actually listen? How do you keep them attentive? How do you retain audience members? And then how do you monetize those audience members?" And we did like an analysis of our show. We were like, in terms of piquing people's interest and retaining listeners, we're solid. Like we really have not dipped far below. It's continuous. There's not a lot of dips on the curve in terms of like, aside from seasonality in podcasts. January is always going to suck. And people have piqued their interest. We've retained them, but we didn't really have much like marketing or monetization capabilities outside of like when we go to conferences, people go, "Oh, you have a podcast? I'm going to check it out." And so like without us, going out and talking to people at Seek or going out and talking to people at conferences, we weren't getting discovered. The Instagram has helped that. Now we're working on that 4th stool of monetization, and it's been tough.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, and you guys, so you mentioned live shows. Like how often do you do live shows?
Well, we just did one this weekend, so that was it's pretty recent in the brain. We were at the Young Catholic Professionals Conference in Dallas, and we did a live show there, which was a ton of fun. Got a few different leads for some other live shows that we might get to do later this year, so the frequency might go up. But typically, like we did one in October is the last one that we did here in Oklahoma City, and then before that we went to Seek. And we did our own live show. We weren't formally invited. So it's kind of a couple times a year just because we're so far away from each other. Patrick's in Florida and I'm in Oklahoma. But we'll be at the National Eucharistic Congress this year as well, doing a live show. So I think it's starting to pick up because I think, especially with the advent of our dating portion of the show, we added we just did Sunday uploads for a long time, but we had this small segment called Dr. Ethan's Dating Corner, Doctor of the Mind, Surgeon of the Heart. And at the end of every podcast, we would answer 1 or 2 dating questions from our audience. And we started getting so many questions and people started loving it so much. So we broke it out into its own episode. So now we upload Sunday, Wednesday, and then a Friday for patrons. And the dating thing is huge because like one of the things we got invited to potentially be a part of is the National Catholic Singles Conference, which I'm really excited about the potential of doing that. But I think there's a lot of people out there that could use a more masculine approach to dating advice. I think a lot of stuff out there is somewhat feminine coded, and so I think there is an opportunity in the market to take advantage of that and do a lot of comedy dating advice shows in the future. So, man, I'd love to do a lot more, but we're obviously constrained by young children and then both of our wives being pregnant at the moment, which, as you can imagine, restricts us a little bit in a good way. I'm happy to be home,
right?
But you can't do as much of it when you're not a single guy.
On one hand, our families are preventing us from giving live dating advice. On the other hand, our families are what qualifies us, I believe, to
exactly
give the dating advice. A lot of dating advice is being given by single people, and to that I say, fine. You probably have something good to say. However, is it working? I don't know.
Right. I wouldn't go to a...
Ethan and I both dated 2 people. We married one of those 2 people, batting 500.
I wouldn't go to a gym with a 600-pound personal trainer. That's all I'm going to say.
That's all I'm saying.
Right.
That's all I'm saying.
No, that's so cool. That's interesting. You're finding like a kind of a niche within your niche podcast already. That's really cool.
And it is splitting the audience a little bit because some people do only listen to the dating corner and some people skip the dating corner. It does depend on whether they are single. And so eventually these are probably going to have to split into separate brands. or we have a feed for Dr. Ethan's dating order, because that would open up a you know a pretty obvious, you know, interconnection of like of social media, that giving short form dating advice, and then having a longer form podcast, and then some kind of Catholic dating course. That just seems like an obvious.
It's a much more vertical.
Right.
It's a much more vertical thing than just the Catholic culture show that's comedy on Sundays, the dating comedy advice show on Wednesdays. It's like we'll figure it out, but we don't need to do Curb Your Enthusiasm until Seinfeld is a hit. Do you know what I'm saying? So give us some time.
That's really cool. What's your recommendation for others who are, you know, already doing podcasts like myself, or thinking about starting podcasts? I think there's a lot of value in podcasting right now, whether you're an entrepreneur or a business or just somebody that wants to have fun. After all your 7.5, 8 years of knowledge, what would you recommend?
You got to figure out something that you actually want to do, because if you don't want to do it, then eventually you're going to not do it. And so if you're doing it for your business, and it's like, oh, we work for medical device sales, let's do a medical device sales podcast, but that's not actually what you care about, then like you're going to do it for a few months and then you're going to stop because you're going to find reasons to not do it anymore. I think a much better thing would be figure out a podcast, something that's really interesting to you, like history, and do a history podcast and just mention that you're a medical device salesperson, you know, along the way, and kind of leverage it that way. It doesn't have to necessarily be about the thing that you're trying to build. And I think that that's something that people don't really understand. I have a lot more advice, but we can go back and forth. Patrick, you have another tip?
Yeah, starting versus continuing. I mean, like, if you started a podcast, don't stop it, and like don't rethink, you know, like, oh man, maybe I should be doing a podcast about the history of medical device sales. You know, like, instead of just, you know, maybe I should just continue it. Set an arbitrary goal for yourself. Like, if I don't hit X number by this, I'm going to stop. And then if you get there, you don't want to stop, keep going. But like, honestly, the advice that every creator gives is true. It's like, everyone's going to hate their first episodes. So just get through those first episodes as quick as possible. Right. Because you're going to hate them. So just keep going and going and going. And if you pass, I think it's like, if you pass 6 weeks of recording, most podcasts stop before that. So you're good. If you've recorded more than 6 episodes, you're in.
Nice. I like that.
People just need to try. I think there's a lot of jibber jabber and not a lot of doing stuff. You know, we should start a podcast.
Yeah, people don't really know what it means to try.
Yeah, it's like, if you just came up with some ideas and just did your best and then took some feedback, it's great. Like, the reason that we're good at what we do, like, I was talking to Patrick about this the other day, like, multiple people came up to me this weekend in casual conversation and they were like, Ethan, you're so funny, which took me aback. And it was like, really, it was surprising and also flattering. I was like, Patrick, why is everybody saying this all of a sudden? He goes, well, you work at home and you spend all of your time either working or doing a comedy podcast. So like, that's the thing that you spend all of your time on, and you have been spending all of your time on for the last 7 years. So it makes sense that when you're outside with people, you know, they would all think that you're funny. I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, like, that's something that I've just developed that I haven't even realized that I've developed. And so I think people want that result immediately. Like, just because you start a comedy podcast doesn't mean you're funny. You know, just because you start a history podcast doesn't mean you're an expert in history. Like, you have to actually become an expert in a thing, and that takes a decade of work, which is helpful for us because we started when we were 19. But if you're 28 now, just start, and then you'll be an expert when you're 38. And who cares? You know, you'll still be cool. You'll still be better than Howard Stern, who runs the worst Sirius XM show of all time. I hate the way Howard Stern interviews. It's a side note.
This is a Howard Stern podcast. Howie, if you're listening, and I know you.
Not Howie Mandel. We like Howard Stern.
Oh, I was calling him Howie out of disrespect.
Okay. How?
Is there anything you guys are working on right now for the future, other than, I know you mentioned the potential of splitting out? I mean, obviously, kind of seeing how this dating episodes go. Anything that you can talk about that you're like excited about?
Patrick?
So we can talk
Yeah,
about
go
the
ahead. Go
course.
tell them about how we built the course.
Yeah, so we were talking to a podcast guy who does he's a Catholic guy, but he doesn't do a Catholic podcast. But he gave us some advice about market testing and at a conference we went to. And so I was like, all right, I'll just a little bit of market testing. And so I pulled our Instagram, and I was like, hey, would you guys do a course? Would you guys consume a course if we created one? Like 96% of people said yes, and 25% of people said they would do it and they would pay for it. And I was like, well, let's do this. And so we made like a mini course, and we made it pay what you want, and we made so much more than our investment into it. And so then we made an expanded course, and it's obviously because it's a higher ticket item. It's and it's not polished yet. We're selling it at 80% off at 80% done. So it's 80% done. We're giving you 80% discount. It's not growing as fast as the original mini course did. But we're like learning how to. It's basically a monetization of our Instagram audience, because our Instagram audience is very apologetics focused, and so our course is very apologetics focused as well. And so we're trying to find a way to maybe make the Instagram and the course monetization a little more integrated, and then the podcast can be kind of like the podcast is never going to be about apologetics, but it's a good support for we're personality driven, intellectual, etc.
Yeah, and one thing that we learned is we did this lead magnet, basically the pay what you want offering, and we got a ton of emails from it. Over 1,000 people downloaded it in like a month, and so we were like, great, we'll just market the course version of this to the email list. And we were getting great open rates on those emails, but our conversion rate was really low. And we were like, what the heck? Like, this is right up the alley. Like we know this is good. What's the deal? And we realized, or at least I think I realized, and maybe Patrick shares my sentiment, I'm not sure, but I think people were really familiar with us from Instagram. And then we took that Instagram and then we started filling up their email inbox. And I think that confused people. I think it wasn't like you didn't see our little icon in the corner and you couldn't click over to our profile and be like, oh yeah, these guys make all the things that are really funny. And that's where I got okay, yeah, that makes sense. These guys are great. It was like an email where there were extra steps because it just was our names. And we don't really have our names out there a ton. Like if you know us, then you know us. But to the average person who maybe likes someone who likes all of our reels and follows us might not know that your name's Patrick and my name's Ethan. Which is what it said at the bottom of the email, like Ethan and Patrick. So it's like, shoot. So that's why what he was talking about is making sure that Instagram is properly monetized, is making sure that we're learning how to sell through Instagram DMs. And there's like a CRM that you can integrate with Instagram called ManyChat, which a lot of people use, and figuring out how to best utilize this, because we have thousands of people that have DM'd us and asked us for the toolkit that we made. And then we never really responded to them on Instagram. We responded to them in email. And so figuring out a way to go back through there and try and then eventually automate it and get it to be just its own machine. But it's these little bumps along the way that you're like, oh man, I wish I would have known that before I spent all this time writing these emails.
It did indicate one thing, is that I must be really good at writing email subject lines, not so much emails.
It's great. Super helpful.
I love that insight. I'm glad you walked us through that. Like that's super interesting, like to learn people's processes. Obviously, everything you do is a test almost. Like it's always gonna be a learning experience. You're gonna like reiterate, come back, do something better. So I think that's super interesting how you guys are doing that. What is personally, what's one thing that you piece of advice you give to young, let's just say young Catholic guys, maybe even Catholic guys who are wanting to do something on the side, like both of you, and then balance having a family, kids, like all that stuff. What's been something that's really helped you guys do what you do and be who you are?
Smoking weed, probably.
Advice to young guys or young married guys? Because that's two different.
Those are two different pieces.
Let's do young married guys. Let's let's do that.
My advice to young unmarried guys is you have so much more time than you think. Dude. Like just seriously, you are not spending enough time.
Lay off the weed. Lay off the video.
Spend literally all of, you have an 8-hour day and you have 8-hour evenings. Just seriously, just spend all. You have 2 jobs now if you want to do a side hustle. Like if you were I was in youth ministry, I wish I had done more work. on my side hustle outside of the clock. Anyway, the opposite is true. Almost the opposite is true. Like with marriage, it's like you have to make decisions together, and you have to explain the decisions that you're making, and you have to explain your logic step by step, and you have to not get emotional about it, and you don't have to like. There's a really great book about dreams, and it's written by a guy who about your dream job. I think it's called Quitter. Actually, it's by John Acuff, and he talks about how the spouse interplay of like you and your spouse and your dream, and it's like sometimes your dream becomes a second spouse, and you're married to the dream more than you're married to your spouse. And when the spouse has a problem with your dream, you're like, how dare you not, like, I'll show you. And that's not an attitude you want in marriage. Like, I'll prove to you that my dream is worthwhile when we're successful. It needs to be a decision you make together. And then sometimes that means both of you are making sacrifices, which means your spouse is taking care of the kids more. And like, that's not an easy thing to request of a spouse, you know?
Man, I think. I mean, I wish I had someone giving me advice. So I don't know if I can necessarily give the best advice. But you just have to prioritize things pretty ruthlessly. And like this morning, I missed out on, there's like a men's group that happens every week at someone's house. 6 a.m. coffee. It's a great time when I'm able to go. But the mornings from the child is my responsibility basically until 6:30 in the morning, so my wife can get as much sleep as possible. And then from there, I'll either like work out or I'll get ready. If I'm working out that day, I'll work out then. And if I'm not working out that day, then I'm helping with breakfast and getting ready and all these things, trying to start my day off right. And so I just don't have time in the mornings to do a men's group. I'd love to go. You know, sometimes in the evenings, people are saying like, hey, can we do this? Can we do that? Sorry, I can't. I have to record the podcast every Thursday night with Patrick. I just can't. If I miss it, then the whole week is thrown off. Like everything is a mess. You know, I don't have as much time to like read the books that I want to read or watch the shows and movies that I want to watch. Why? Because I have things to do. I have to learn how to build an Instagram CRM. I don't want to do that. Like I would much rather watch Ford versus Ferrari again and again and again, but I got to do this other thing. And so it's ruthlessly prioritizing and making sure, like Patrick said, your wife and your family come first, and then everything flows out of that, right? You have to provide for them. You got to do your day job. You got to have health insurance. You got to make sure, you know, all your needs are provided for. But then after that, there's a lot of wiggle room. You know, what are you spending time on that you maybe shouldn't be spending time on? And I think if we're honest, there's a lot of it. So there goes Mitch. He's back.
Hey,
okay.
I'm back.
Mitch left. Okay.
So that's what I would say.
I love that.
You turned into the end. You turned in the end of. Never mind. I was going to reference those like Rankin Bass Christmas.
I was going to say he looked like
the VHSs.
He looked like Interstellar in there.
At the end of those videos, they would have those color bars, and then they would scream at you.
Why?
I remember that from my childhood. I don't know if you guys do. I don't know, man. I don't understand VHS, that ancient technology where we used to bang each other with sticks.
I forget how old you are. You watched VHS.
You're older than me. What are you talking about?
I watch VHS too for a little bit. My coworkers always joke because I'm the youngest, and they assume I don't know these things. Like I watch VHS. Like I'm not that young. Like you know,
back in my day, we used to have a rotary dial. Bet you don't know what that is. Like I do. Like I have seen. It's like the world didn't start when I was born. Like I've seen stuff that's older than me. What do you think? I'm stupid? Do you think I'm just dumb? It's like you don't have a problem with me being young. You just think I'm stupid. Is what it is. That's the issue you have.
Well, thank you both for being on. Seriously, big fans of you guys and just what you're doing. So I really appreciate the time. Seriously, thanks for all the good advice, and hope to stay in touch.
Yes.
And best of luck with future of the podcast.
Thank you. And best of luck to you. I love the Catholic Entrepreneur Podcast. I wanted to do this, but I decided to do a dating show instead. So again, you got to prioritize. So you're doing, you're doing it right. I think this is important. I think all Catholic business people need to know about each other. We all need to be giving each other jobs. We all need to be giving each other work. Like there just needs to be a whole Catholic business ecosystem. It's starting to get built, but it needs to be way more robust. And so I think even things like what you're doing all the way up to like Cent and YCP are super critical for this era of the economy. So thank you for having us on.
Absolutely. Appreciate it so much. God bless,
See ya.
guys.
Thanks, man.
See ya.
Have a good one. Bye.